Dawn, June 25, 1950. The sun rose over the Korean peninsula, cutting through the mist and silence of a humid summer morning. And then, thunder. Across the 38th parallel, a wall of steel and fire surged south. 135,000 North Korean troops, backed by Soviet tanks and artillery, stormed across the border in just hours. The fragile peace shattered. Villages were swallowed in smoke. Families fled. Seoul, the South Korean capital, trembled under the echo of shell fire. The world had barely recovered from the devastation of World War II. Just 5 years earlier, Americans and Soviets had stood side by side, victorious over Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan. They called it the war to end all wars. But peace, it seemed, was not built to last. Because this was not supposed to happen. The Korean War was more than just another regional conflict. It was the moment when Washington realized that the next great battle wouldn't be fought between nations for land, but between ideologies for the soul of the world. Freedom versus communism, democracy versus dictatorship. It was the first spark of the Cold War, and the fire would burn for decades. The Korean War would kill millions, divide families, and set the stage for every global confrontation that followed. Vietnam, Cuba, Berlin, all began here, on this peninsula of mountains and sorrow. And from the ashes of that forgotten war, a new world order was born. This was the story of the birth of the Cold War. In 1945, as Japan's empire collapsed, Korea, once a proud and unified nation, was suddenly up for grabs. For 35 years, the Koreans had lived under Japanese colonial rule. When Japan surrendered, they expected freedom, but instead, they got division. At the end of World War II, American officials in Washington and Soviet commanders in Moscow hastily drew a line across a map. The 38th parallel, the Soviets would occupy the north, the Americans the south. It was supposed to be temporary, but temporary became permanent, and that line would soon harden into one of the most dangerous borders on Earth. In the north, the Soviets installed a young guerrilla fighter, Kim Il-sung. He had spent the war years fighting the Japanese and now promised a socialist Korea under Moscow's guidance. In the south, the Americans backed Syngman Rhee, an older nationalist who had spent decades in exile opposing Japanese rule and now spoke the language of democracy, but ruled with an iron fist. Two Koreas, two leaders, two visions. Both claimed to be the legitimate government of all Korea, and both were preparing for a fight to prove it. By 1948, the last Soviet and American troops withdrew, but their influence did not. The United States left behind weapons, advisors, and money. The Soviets left tanks, artillery, and ideology. Across the world, former allies were becoming enemies. The Soviet Union detonated its first atomic bomb. China fell to Mao's communists in 1949, and in Washington, the word containment became the new policy, a promise to stop communism from spreading anywhere, at any cost. By the spring of 1950, Soviet tanks and weapons were flowing freely into North Korea. Kim Il-sung was convinced he could reunite the peninsula by force. Stalin approved the plan. Mao offered support. The fuse was lit. June 25, 1950. At dawn, North Korea launched a massive coordinated invasion across the 38th parallel. The attack came without warning, a blitzkrieg of artillery, tanks, and infantry that overwhelmed the ill-prepared South Korean army. In days, Seoul fell within 3 days. American forces in Japan scrambled to respond. The world watched as the first hot war of the Cold War began. President Harry S. Truman faced a decision unlike any before. If he acted, the United States would be committing itself to a new kind of conflict, not for conquest, but for containment. If he didn't, communism would sweep through Asia.
On Sunday, June 25th, Communist forces attacked the Republic of Korea.
Truman chose to fight under the flag of the United Nations. 16 nations joined the effort, but make no mistake, this was an American war
For all forces of the members of the United Nations fighting in Korea.
General Douglas MacArthur, the hero of the Pacific, was placed in command. Operating from Tokyo, he saw the war not just as a mission to defend South Korea, but to strike a blow against global communism itself. By August, the situation was desperate. South Korean and UN forces were trapped in a small corner of the peninsula known as the Pusan Perimeter, barely holding off the North's relentless advance. The fate of Korea, and perhaps the credibility of the United States, hung by a thread. But then, MacArthur conceived a plan, bold, risky, and almost insane. He called it Operation Chromite.
Initiate Operation Chromite.
A surprise amphibious landing at a place no one expected. September 15th, 1950. Before dawn, waves of American and UN troops landed at Inchon, far behind enemy lines. The tides were dangerous, the harbor narrow, but the gamble paid off. Within days, MacArthur's forces had recaptured Seoul and cut off the North Korean army from its supply lines. It was one of the most daring military operations in modern history, and it turned the war completely. By October, UN forces had pushed the North Koreans all the way back across the 38th parallel, and then beyond. MacArthur wanted total victory, to reunite all of Korea under the South. Truman hesitated. He feared pushing too far would provoke China, but MacArthur ignored the warnings. He pressed north toward the Yalu River, the border with China. Then winter came, and with it, a storm from the mountains. In late November, hundreds of thousands of Chinese troops poured across the Yalu, catching the UN forces completely off guard. They called themselves the People's Volunteers, but their attack was anything but voluntary. Seoul fell again. The dream of reunification died in the snow. The war had turned once more. The defeat ignited fury in Washington. MacArthur blamed the politicians for tying his hands. He wanted to take the war to China, even suggesting the use of atomic bombs to stop the advance. Truman refused. He knew the stakes, another world war, possibly nuclear. For Truman, containment was the strategy, not annihilation. For MacArthur, it was weakness. Their clash became public, bitter, and dangerous. In April 1951, Truman made a decision that shocked the world. He fired General Douglas MacArthur. Millions of Americans were outraged. MacArthur returned home to a hero's welcome, but Truman stood firm, and in doing so, defined the limits of America's new power. No one man, not even a general, could decide the fate of the world. The age of total war had ended. Oh, the age of limited war had begun. The war dragged on. Front lines froze roughly where they had begun, near the 38th parallel, but the fighting was brutal. Hills captured, lost, and captured again at the cost of thousands of lives. While soldiers bled in the trenches, diplomats fought over the peace table. The world had split in two. The United States led NATO in the West. The Soviet Union built its own bloc in the East. Each side armed faster, spied deeper, and trusted less in Washington. Defense budgets soared. In Moscow, propaganda painted America as the new imperial enemy. And in Korea, ordinary people paid the price for both. July 27, 1953, at a small village called Panmunjom, negotiators finally signed an armistice. Not peace, just silence. After 3 years, millions were dead or missing. The border remained almost exactly where it began. Families were forever separated, but something much larger had changed. The Korean War had proven that the Cold War was not cold at all. It was global, deadly, and permanent. From Berlin to Havana, Vietnam to Afghanistan, the same struggle would repeat: proxy wars, ideological battles, and the constant shadow of the bomb. Korea had become the blueprint, the first experiment in how superpowers would fight without ever declaring war on each other. As President Truman said, "We have learned at terrible cost that freedom must be defended at every point on the globe." The world now lived under the threat of annihilation, and the Cold War had truly begun. Between 1950 and 1953, the Korean War drew the map of a new age. It created the idea of containment, the rise of the military-industrial complex, and the reality of permanent global tension. A divided Korea still stands as its monument, a scar that never healed. The war that was never declared, never won, and never ended became the war that defined the world, the birth of the Cold War, 1950 to 1953, the war that made the world choose sides.